Welcome to the fifth of our series of Easter reflections. If you're doing it one day at a time, then this is the Good Friday reflection, and we're focusing very much on when Jesus actually is crucified and dies on the cross. We're looking at the Centurion and his view of all of that. And in a moment, Andrew McMillan is going to read to us from Matthew 27, verses 27 to 54. To help us prepare as we think about that passage. Let's begin though by saying a prayer. Father, we thank you that you sent your only Son to die for us, that you demonstrated your love, that you dealt with our sin, that you saved us from your anger, and you lifted us into a new relationship with you that leads to eternal life. Lord, we owe so much to the centrality of the cross in our faith. As we come now to reflect on that central message, that central point of our faith, help us to hear what you're saying by your Spirit and to grow deeper in our knowledge of Christ and our faith in you. Amen. So over to Andrew for our reading.
Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall. But after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charge against him: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him from noon until 3 p.m. Darkness came over all the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord.
The centurion would have been a tough soldier. He was in charge of a group of 80 to 200 soldiers himself. And to reach that position, he would have been a soldier for many years. He would have been someone who was respected, who was very able at what he was doing. He would have been someone who was trusted by the people in charge to enforce Roman rule, particularly on those troublesome Jewish citizens of Jerusalem. And this tough centurion with his group of soldiers was very much a part of Jesus being crucified on that first Good Friday. And actually in our passage from verses 27 all the way through to 37, it's the soldiers that are acting, the soldiers that are doing things all the time. And this centurion wouldn't have been an easy pushover by any means. He wouldn't have been a compassionate person. He would have been involved in leading a group of men who were very brutal in what they were about and very harsh in putting things down. And yet he may well have been a literate man. He may well have been able to read and write in order to be able to communicate as an officer within the Roman army. Although probably in Jerusalem he wasn't a proper Roman legionary, he would have been in charge of an auxiliary force brought of people, probably non-Jewish because they were having to control the Jewish population, but from some of the local non-Jewish population and brought in as auxiliaries to help maintain Roman rule in that place. The question we're faced with is that at the end of our passage, right at the climax of the passage, this Roman centurion and the soldiers with him come to a mighty conclusion. And I think Matthew wants us to look at the cross through the eyes of this centurion. Why do I say that? Well, in verse 36, it tells us that the centurion with the soldiers sitting down kept watch or guarded Jesus on the cross. And then in verse 48, it says, in verse 54, it says, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw, then they came to this conclusion. What a conclusion it was, that Jesus was the Son of God. So as we look at this passage, the key question we're coming to is this: why did the centurion come to that conclusion? Why did the centurion decide that Jesus was the Son of God? That's certainly not the position he started off believing. The soldiers gathered together once Jesus was handed over to them by Pilate. Remember, Jesus had been flogged, so he would have been in a very pitiful state, blood pouring from his body, scars across his back. And he's brought into the praetorium, to the place where the Roman soldiers met, and the whole guard come together. It could have been up to 600 of them. And there they are. And he got Jesus there. And what's Jesus accused of? He's accused of being king of the Jews. And what was their role? Well, their role was to make sure the Jews were kept down and the Romans kept in power. And so they took up this opportunity to be bullies. They took up this opportunity to cruelly mock Jesus. You see the way they do it. They strip him down. They take his clothes off. They create a crown of thorns to put on his head, a painful mockery of this idea that he's king of the Jews. They put a red cloak around him, this naked person pitifully clothed in a red cloak, and they give him a rod, which they then go on to beat him with. After they've held him mockingly as king of the Jews, they beat him and they spit on him. And imagine being someone who's spat at and having your head being whacked over your head. It's an awful position to be in, a terrible position to have. And yet this was the attitude of the centurion and the soldiers at the start. They didn't care about Jesus. They weren't concerned whether he was some important Jewish figure. To them, he was like a mouse caught in the mouth of a cat. Just someone to be cruelly played with and mocked. And as Christians, as we reflect on what happened to Jesus that Good Friday, as we reflect on the mocking he received, the bullying he received, when we find ourselves as Christians mocked for our faith, when we find ourselves belittled, put down, even bullied or abused because of it, remember that we walk the same path as Jesus. He was there before us. He understands what we're going through, but also we can be encouraged that in walking that path we may suffer for now, but like Christ, we will know glory and resurrection life. A centurion and a soldier started off as bullies, and Jesus had to face them as such. But once they crucified Jesus, they sat back and watched. Mark's Gospel tells us that was about 9 o'clock in the morning. And they would have crucified Jesus in a very public place. This was meant to be a very public humiliation, and crucifixions often happened by the roadside of very busy roads. And we're not sure exactly where Golgotha was, but probably it was on one of the busy roads that was near a gate going in and out of Jerusalem. And there they would have watched as the Jewish people came passing by. And Matthew tells us that many of them shook their heads and they mocked Jesus. They remembered the things he was accused of in the trial before the Sanhedrin, that Jewish council, how they accused him of saying he would tear down the temple and then build it again in 3 days. And then accused him of asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus seems to say yes. And they look at him now, this pitiful figure, covered in blood, dying a horrific and horrible death, naked before the crowds of people. And they say to him, "If you're the Son of God, then come down, prove it." Surely across this humiliation is evidence that everything you said was rubbish. It's not just the general passers-by that come, it is people from that council, the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law. And they come and they mock Jesus too. They say he saved others. Really? Maybe they'd only heard the stories of miracles and hadn't seen them themselves. Most of the miracles happened in Galilee, away from Jerusalem. Maybe they thought this was proof that he wasn't really a saviour, he wasn't really a miracle worker. Otherwise he would save himself from the cross, wouldn't he? And King of Israel? What a ridiculous idea. How could this man dying this horrible death be the King of Israel? And Son of God? That's what he claimed at the trial. And yet surely this was proof that he wasn't Son of God. If he was Son of God, wouldn't God come and rescue him from the cross? You see what is happening here. Both the passers-by and the Jewish authorities think that they've got a test to decide whether Jesus is truly who he is. They think if he can't rescue himself from the cross, then surely that's proof that he's failed their test. That's proof that he isn't who he claims to be. And yet who are they to devise a test for God? Who are they to decide what hoops Jesus needs to jump through to prove that he really is who he says he is? Actually, God will save Jesus, not from death, but by raising him from the dead. Not from dying, but from the grave. Jesus will be vindicated by God, but not in the way that the teachers of the law and the elders and the chief priests demand. But God will vindicate him in his way and on his terms. And for us again, as we reflect on this, as we come to God, do we sometimes say, "God, look, we'll only trust you, or only do this way if you show yourself to me, show you that this is the right way, you show yourself in the right way." And God says, "I've shown you enough. I've proved myself enough to you. You need to trust me." And for those that we come across that refuse to believe in God unless God does something to prove himself to them, again, Can't we challenge them and say, what right have you to decide how God should prove himself to you? Who are you? God's done enough to prove himself. Let's look at Jesus again. Look at who he is. Look at how he died on the cross, and look at how God raised him from the dead. We need to respond to the mockers and challenge their tests of God. So how then did this centurion and the soldiers become persuaded that Jesus was the Son of God? So far we've seen that they started off today thinking him just a pitiful figure to mock and bully and ridicule, a plaything. And then they've heard other people come by and give what they felt was obviously convincing proofs that this wasn't the Son of God, that he was a fraud, that he was a liar. How did the centurion and the soldiers finally get to the end of the day and decide that Jesus was the Son of God? Well, because of the strange things that happen next. Firstly, at noon, the sky goes dark, a foreboding sign, a sign of God's displeasure at what is happening. No doubt, as the centurion sat there watching Jesus on the cross, this would have made him begin to think. And then Jesus cries out in a loud voice after it's been dark for nearly 3 hours, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." And the people listening on think, oh, maybe he's crying for Elijah. Perhaps the centurion and the soldiers knew enough about Jewish religion to know that Elijah was an important figure, and there were real expectations that something amazing would happen when Elijah comes back. Maybe this began to make them think about who this really was and whether he was someone bringing about something from God. Or maybe they heard even more what Jesus was actually saying. My God, why have you forsaken me? Maybe they sensed that there was a deep, powerful relationship between this man and God, and something tragic and awful happening at this moment. This sense of being cut off from God. And then just as Jesus dies, he cries out with a loud voice. The centurion and the soldiers watching on, this would have been very strange, because people die on the cross by gradually getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and then finally running out of breath, so they suffocate. Jesus doesn't die in that way. Rather, he seems still to be in control by crying out. And more than that, Matthew says he gave up his spirit. It's almost that Jesus decided this was the moment he would die. He went willingly to his death. This wasn't the sign of a victim. This was a sign of someone giving himself in sacrifice for others. And then most importantly, probably and most dramatically for the centurion, was the earthquake. Matthew particularly mentions that as the thing that really made them afraid. And for them in those days, I mean, earthquakes are, I'm sure, terrifying things to be a part of. But in those days too, it would have been a sign of God's displeasure, of God acting as well. And they would have, I don't know, they knew about the consequences of the earthquake, or the things linked with it. But we're told that this earthquake, when this earthquake happens, that the curtain in the temple was ripped from top to bottom. The people had mocked Jesus and said to him, you can destroy the temple. Yeah, there you are, being destroyed yourself on the cross. And yet as Jesus died, a symbol of a temple is just ripped in two and destroyed. Is this a sign that Jesus really is destroying the temple? That he really is going to rebuild something else in 3 days' time? Well, we know he was, wasn't he? The temple would no longer be the true way to God. The true way to God will be through Jesus Christ himself, who's bringing a new way, a new relationship with God, based not on the sacrifices in the temple, but by this one sacrifice for himself on the cross to bring salvation. And not only with that, but Matthew tells us this very strange thing about the tombs being cracked open. And then after Jesus is resurrected, people coming alive, being resurrected from the dead and appearing to people in the city, the holy ones of old. And we don't know exactly what this is going on here. We don't know how this fits in with history exactly. It seems very strange. It's not in the other Gospels. And yet surely what Matthew is trying to tell us is that at this moment of the cross, Jesus is winning the ability to bring salvation even to the dead, even to those who have died before Christ, trusting in God, the holy ones, the saints. The people that mocked Jesus accused him of not being able to save himself. But now Jesus, in his death on the cross, is bringing salvation. Salvation even from death. Salvation even to the dead. We don't know the centurion has heard or seen anything about the temple being destroyed or the curtain being ripped in two. We don't, and almost definitely he didn't really know much about these people being raised from the dead in some way. And yet the earthquake was enough. He realised that what the mockers had been condemning, that there was something incredibly special about this man. And if the mockers had been condemning this man, then maybe they were wrong and he was right. Maybe when they said he wasn't the Son of God, they got it completely wrong, and he realised that Jesus was the Son of God. And here we are, at the end of Matthew's Gospel, almost. And who is it that's claiming that Jesus is the Son of God? Who is the first person outside the very closest disciples to realise who he was? A non-Jew. And as Jesus has been warning throughout the Gospel, when the Jewish people turn away from God, when they turn away from his Messiah, when they reject his Son, then God will bring other people in. And so now, this centurion, this person whose very role is to suppress the Jews, has come to understand who their true king is, to realise who the Son of God is. You wouldn't really expect that, would you? And yet this is the first where Jesus says later on, having risen from the dead, go and make disciples of all nations. And for us as Christians, are there people that maybe God's saying, look, you'll be surprised that this person will be persuaded, but they will. Maybe particularly in this time when there's a pandemic and people's lives and attitudes are being shaken up. Maybe God's saying, look, new people are going to be persuaded. New people are going to see who Jesus really is, and it's going to really shock you and surprise you. People you would never expect will come to faith in Christ. Well, as we look at this passage about the cross, I want to leave you with 3 questions to reflect on. Firstly, the bullies. How can Jesus' example help us to cope in a world that ridicules and bullies Christians? Secondly, the mockers. Do we have our tests for God? Or do we know people that lay down their tests for God? How are we going to respond to them? And the persuaded. What surprising person might God want you to help persuade about Jesus?